Hi everyone. To kind of start off here before you watch this video, there's a couple notes I want to make. One, I'm aware that the audio is messed up. I've been sitting on this interview forever because I've been intending to fix the audio. However, that's not going to happen. I hope the echo on my behalf does not take away from the quality of the conversation. I feel it's more important to share this than to keep worrying about the audio and then not letting anyone see this conversation I had with Mr. Kuttab. Another note is that this was recorded on October 2nd in anticipation of October 7th, which is the anniversary of the start of this war. Given that this is from several months ago, there's some contextual information, such as the election was very relevant. October 7th was a month before the election. It was very up in the air. We now know that Trump has won, which is a whole nother conversation to be had about how this will affect the war. But since then, some of the most relevant things that were happening around the time when we had this conversation, a couple weeks prior, were the pager attacks that have now been claimed by Israel against Hezbollah. Since then, the war has expanded into Lebanon, and Hamas is no longer the primary subject of this war, as at least currently. Hezbollah is probably just as equal as a target. That's where the war stands today. But I hope you all enjoy this conversation. And it was really nice to speak to Mr. Kuttab. Thanks for saying yes to my interview. I hope everyone is able to find a little bit of value in this. Everyone, Happy New Year. This is not Save the Vibes Live, but I'll see you another day.
We are not live. You're listening to Save the Vibes, not live on KRUI 89.7 FM. I'm your host, Sweet Jorna, and today I'm joined by Palestinian civil rights and human rights attorney Jonathan Kuttab. Thank you so much for coming on today.
You're welcome.
You are an experienced attorney internationally and the co-founder of human rights group Al-Haq and the co-founder of Nonviolence International, as well as author of the book Beyond the Two-State Solution. And off the top, I want to initially frame this by stating that although I'm speaking to you today as a professional, as a legal, for your legal expertise on the question of Palestine, also feel free to include any personal connection as well. As a Palestinian yourself, I'm interested in asking as many questions about Palestine as the next person interested in as the next interested American, but I don't want to shy away from the fact that I have no personal connection to Palestine, and this is a deeply personal issue to millions of Palestinians globally. Unfortunately, it seems like the censorship of the Palestinian cause in mainstream news has been really effective, and what little we do see in the news, the humanization of Palestine, of Palestinian people, has not proven itself to be a priority of news coverage. So I think it's important that you can provide input on both aspects of that discussion.
Thank you very much for saying this, because many times Palestinians feel that we are worse than invisible. We are portrayed in a very negative way. Our suffering, our humanity is usually denied. So any opportunity that you give us, that you give me, to present Palestinians as human beings, to present our perspective, I think is a great service that you are doing.
To dive into the most relevant news about Palestine, there's currently a lot unfolding in the region, almost too much to include in a rundown right now, but we're just days away from the anniversary of the initial attacks by Hamas on October 7th that instigated the current stretch of conflict. And a ceasefire honestly seems further away than it did a year ago with some of the most recent escalations. Now that Israel is bordering a full war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iran is intensifying its position just yesterday, launching a barrage of missiles into Israel. It looks like the war is expanding, which has happened many times over in prior wars, but historically, has the involvement of surrounding nations or militant groups that claim to be acting in support of Palestinians, has that ever tangibly benefited the Palestinian cause, or does it typically overshadow it?
That's a very good question. because Palestinians always live in this tension between asserting their identity. We are Palestinians. We're not just part of an amorphous Arab world. We are Palestinians. We have the right to speak for ourselves. We have our right of self determination. Nobody else can speak for us. At the same time, part of that tension is we know we are so small and so weak and so vulnerable that we always want to appeal to the rest of the Arab world and, in fact, the rest of humanity. That our cause has, in fact, become the cause of oppressed people everywhere. And it's not an accident that now it has become a very important issue for even students in the United States, because ultimately what happens to us ends up happening to other people. So our struggle for freedom ends up affecting everybody's struggle. The attempts to suppress the student movement, for example, over the issue of Palestine, is now extending to suppressing the student movement on all issues. The attempt to prevent the BDS movement, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, and even pass legislation against it, is now being utilized to prevent boycotting companies that are hurting the environment. The fossil fuel companies, gun manufacturers, everybody is jumping on the bandwagon. If we can prevent people from boycotting and civil society from acting to put restraints on corporate America and the Palestinian cause, then we can use it in all these other causes as well. So it ends up that when you suppress and deny the humanity of Palestinians, in the end, you are suppressing and denying the humanity of oppressed people everywhere. Yeah, so in that sense, yes, we have always sought, and we think it's important to have solidarity from other people. Although, as you said, sometimes it hurts us as much as it helps us.
Negotiations, even prior to some of the most recent escalations, do not seem to be going anywhere as usual. And as a base, what does the negotiation process look like between the two states? And how is this lack of progress for the Palestinian people continued to time and time again in the negotiation process?
Well, I think the question is, well, there's two questions. Number one, there are those who really don't accept negotiations, who prefer to go to violence and war as the first option, who don't like diplomacy, who think that the only thing that really counts is brute force. And so it's amazing that actually calling for a ceasefire, which in the past used to be the first thing that would happen. The Security Council would gather together, call for a ceasefire, try for de escalation. In this issue, even asking for a ceasefire has been made so contentious for over a year. Everybody's been asking for a ceasefire, and a ceasefire doesn't really solve the problem. It just means get your knee off my neck, allow me to breathe, and then we'll talk about racism, and we'll talk about the conditions, and we'll talk about what I did or didn't do, and we'll talk about the process. But just for now, please get your knee off my neck, get a ceasefire. So there are those who don't like you to even talk about negotiations, who just want violence. And of course, there are those who benefit financially. The war military industrial complex, they make more weapons and they sell more weapons, and it's wonderful. They don't care who kills and who gets killed, as long as they're selling their weapons, and it's fine. So the first question is, does violence is violence the first option, or should we look for other ways? The second option, the second issue that is raised by negotiations is, who has the power in negotiations? Is negotiations just a way to force people to give you what you want anyway or else? Or is there a genuine willingness to listen to the other side, a little empathy, a little give and take, a little compromise, a little uh, way of looking for justice and not just power to resolve an issue? So, yeah, there haven't been any negotiations. Actually, even before October 7, the so called peace process was not happening. The status quo was continuing, the oppression was continuing, the settlements were expanding, the siege on Gaza was in full effect. Nobody seemed to care. People were forgotten. It was like a pressure cooker that eventually exploded. So, yes, there are no negotiations taking place now, and I wish there were, and there need to be, because violence is not the way to solve problems. If there are problems, if there are conflict, if there are issues, we have to find different ways of resolving them rather than just resorting to military might.
You brought up a point a second ago about who has the authority to negotiate on behalf of Palestine. I was going to ask this question a little later on, but the representation of the Palestinian people has been unstable, unofficial at best. Really, the most official governmental entities currently operating in Palestine are the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Both are pretty weak, as Hamas is being depicted as captors of Gazans, and the Palestinian Authority is honestly expected of being a plant by Israel. First, I want to ask about the article that you wrote on the label, the significance of the label of terrorism in the question of representing Palestine and who is allowed to do negotiations, because it seems like all the authorities or people that are willing to do diplomacy on behalf of Palestine get this label of terrorism, that of terrorists, that halts any progress, any legitimacy of their organization.
The answer is simple. People need self determination. People need elections. People need to choose their own representative. But part of the problem with the Palestinians is that Palestinians have not been given the ability to even choose their representatives. Anybody who steps up to represent the Palestinian gets shot, gets deported, gets denied, gets demonized, isn't allowed to even represent Palestinians. So the answer is Palestinians should represent themselves. They shouldn't have somebody else represent them or speak for them. Right now, the closest thing to representing the Palestinians is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. But that has been really squeezed out of the game and replaced in many ways by the Palestinian Authority, which basically serves the interests of the Israelis and what they want. So this is a very legitimate question. Who is allowed to speak for us? Why aren't we allowed to speak for ourselves? And the answer is let's have some elections so that we can elect our representatives to speak for us. If you don't think that Hamas speaks for us or the Palestinian Authority speaks for us, then give us a chance to pick our own representatives. And instead of having other people speak for us and on our behalf.
What have some of those motions to kind of squash the movements to organize looked like? What do those efforts look like?
Well, uh, part of it goes back to the myth that there is no such thing as Palestinians, that Palestine was somehow empty, a land without a people for a people without a land. Because how can you promise that land to the Jews who are being persecuted and who needed a place to go? How can you tell them, we have a nice place here for you called Palestine, if you recognize that it's full of people, that there are human beings living there? So every attempt is made to deny Palestinian existence and Palestinian identity. For many years, the P word, Palestine was not allowed, even in this country, even to this day. And I'll ask you a question. There are Greek restaurants, Italian restaurants, Thai restaurants, Vietnamese restaurants. Do you see a Palestinian restaurant anywhere in the US? People are afraid, they're not allowed. So they have a Middle East restaurant or a Near East restaurant or a Mediterranean restaurant. Uh, Palestinians aren't even allowed to have their name spoken out loud. The Palestinian kufiye, the Palestinian flag is all demonized. You can't use the word Palestine. Palestine becomes synonymous with terrorism, with evil, with something you don't want. And so this is part of the problem that we have is Palestinians aren't allowed to be themselves, to represent themselves, to speak on their own behalf, and to be a people like every other people.
Moving, I guess, adjacent to the question of negotiations and proper representation of the Palestinian people, you have a book called Beyond the Two-State Solution, and in it you detail the significance of considering more options than the creation of a divided and sovereign Israeli state and Palestinian state. Why is the two-state solution no longer feasible as an option? And why are so many actors invested in this falsity that a two-state solution would work?
Well, the two state solution was suggested as a compromise that Palestinians would settle for a small portion of Palestine, 22%, that was captured in 1967, and sort of waive their rights to the rest of Palestine. The problem is that the Zionist movement didn't really want any Palestinian state. So they started building settlements throughout the occupied territories that were occupied in 1967 to the point where now you have about 700,000 Jewish settlers settling in the occupied territories, which makes the two state solution no longer feasible, even in that small portion of Palestine which was occupied. So in my book, I say let's stop fooling ourselves. There's not going to be a Palestinian state. So, what do we have instead? What do we have instead is a situation where there's two groups of people living in Palestine today: Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. There's about 7 million Jewish Israelis, and they're in control of the whole area. But there's still another 7 million Palestinian Arabs who are not disappearing, who are not going anywhere. They tried ethnic cleansing. They tried to push many of them out of Palestine. They tried occupation and keeping them under control. They tried dividing them into different groups and denying them, basically denying them, as I said, self-determination, the ability to speak for themselves. Right now, Israel is facing a new reality that the Palestinians, with every possible disadvantage that you can think of, continue to exist and continue to resist. Which means that what do you do? Where do you go? How do you solve the problem? The two state solution was a possible compromise to solve the problem, but that didn't work because the Zionist movement insisted on settling Jews throughout the occupied territories. So we have to start thinking out of the box. And we have to start thinking beyond the normal terms, beyond Zionism, and maybe even also beyond Palestinian nationalism. How can people live together? How can a situation be created where people can survive and thrive, have their identity, but also be recognized for their identity, have democracy, but not be oppressed by 51%, have basically a situation where you can have your self-determination, but not on the expense of anybody else? Can people live together? Can we have true and genuine equality? Can we have people think of each other as human beings who are living with us rather than subhumans who are barbarians and barbaric and we have nothing to do with them?
The argument against a unified state is that there's simply too much animosity between Israelis and Palestinians. As someone who thoroughly knows the Palestinian people, how do the Palestinian people feel about the idea of an integrated state? And if possible, do you know how the Israeli people feel about an integrated state?
Well, that is basically a lie that says we can't live together, that we are fundamentally different from each other, that there's an enmity that goes back to biblical times. That's not true. We've actually lived together for almost 14 centuries. Before the current century, Arabs and Jews lived together just fine. In fact, the hostility, the enmity, is a result of the modern movement of Zionism, where you want to have a Jewish state just for Jews, or even Palestinian nationalism, that this is just for me. No, we can both share the land. We can live together. Human beings, it is not true that we live in a jungle and that everybody needs to kill everybody else and that it's either domination of others or you will be dominated. This idea that if you're not a wolf, if you're not eating everybody else, you're a sheep and you're going to be eaten. The idea of predator and victim is really a false idea. That's not how the world lives. That's not even the rules of the jungle. You know, you hear about this is jungle. Everybody is killing everybody else. Actually, in the jungle, people coexist. Plants and animals and parasites and insects, they all coexist. There's symbiotic relationships between them. The idea that it's either me or nobody else. I have to be powerful or I am a victim. If I don't kill others, I will be killed. This is a false paradigm. It's a false way of looking at things. We can and should and must live together.
The United States has a lot invested in Israel politically and economically, and I figure it must be seeing a return on these investments to justify continuing to pursue them. It feels within the current scape of the U.S. fully backing Israel and almost an impossibility. It's an impossibility to reverse the circumstances to convince the U.S. on and other world powers to stop providing aid that is contributing to the oppression and the decimation of the Palestinian people. When countries profit so much from the oppression of any global population, what historically has made that oppression costly enough to be reconsidered.
Throughout the world, there has been a movement towards greater rights, human rights, equality, ending slavery, ending apartheid, ending colonialism, moving towards democracy, moving towards human rights, moving towards equality. I mean, even in this country, women didn't have the vote 100 years ago. African Americans were treated as chattel. They were bought and sold. They were not even considered human beings. The world changes. The world improves. The world moves forward. And those who think that we are doomed to continuing fighting and continuing worsening and continuing oppression, I think are false. I think are false. We have to look forward to a better world and a better future. Now, it's true, there are people who are very powerful, who are benefiting tremendously from the arms industry, who are invested in more hatred and more oppression and more violence. But the majority of the people of the world aren't like that. In this country, the majority want peace. The majority want a good situation to live under. And it's a fight. We have to fight for a better situation where everybody can live and everybody can survive and everybody can thrive.
I know sometimes it can feel like a liberal idealism, this transition between valuing things fiscally, financially, and valuing the progress of people. What we've been telling ourselves all this time, that we've become better people. We no longer have to be people of such carnage and battle and war. It can sometimes feel like idealism, but in general, I guess it is true. We do generally become less violent as people, and it's worth an investment to continue that progress in that direction. How would the world benefit? How does the world benefit from investment in the Palestinian people?
Well, the Palestinian people today represents the forefront of humanity. And I don't say that lightly. After World War II, an entire situation was created where you had the United Nations, you had different international organizations, you had conventions for the right of women, conventions for the right of the child, convention for the rights of the disabled. A world order was created, hopefully, so that we won't have war anymore. Unfortunately, it didn't work very well because the superpower kept the right of veto, for example, at the United Nations, where the powerful countries didn't want to be restricted in what they can and cannot do. Uh, Today, the question is, do we live in a world where the powerful can do whatever they want, or do we have international law? You know, people used to think that because of nuclear weapons, because of the carnage of World War One and World War Two, things are so horrible we can't let them just go. We have to have a world that's built on law, at least some kind of regulations, where it's not just dog eat dog and the most powerful can do whatever they want. That continues to be necessary. And when Russia invaded the Ukraine, for example, people said, "Oh, we cannot do that. There's about 200 countries in the world. If every country can invade another country and annex its territory, we'll have chaos." So everybody says international law needs to be respected. But when Israel invades other people and occupies other people, somehow the whole international system is now in question. So, this is what I meant when I said that the Palestinian issue has become an international, worldwide issue. And the question is, what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where whoever's powerful can do whatever they want with no restrictions? Or do we live in a world where there are at least some rules, where there's a distinction between civilian and military targets, where there are limits on what you can do well, during war? You can't bomb hospitals and in universities and refugee camps. You need to have a distinction between civilians and non-civilians. Even if you have a legitimate military objective, you have to watch if there are civilians around so that they don't get hurt. Your response have to be proportionate. You have to distinguish what there are certain weapons that you shouldn't use. The personnel booby trapped weapons. And you cannot capture land and annex it. There are some rules and regulations that should be followed even during a war. When somebody surrenders or is wounded, you have to take them and treat them humanely. You can't just kill them. You can't have genocide. You can't have ethnic cleansing. These have become rules of international law. And the question is, do we abide by these laws, or do we make an exception for our friends, for our allies, for ourselves, for people that we support. When we say it's wrong to attack civilians, and I do, that terrorism is bad, and I do, then you have to maintain that rule for everybody, for friends and foe alike. When we say torture is wrong, you shouldn't torture people, doesn't mean that if they're bad people, you're allowed to torture them. And if you're the good guys, you're allowed to torture, but not if you're the bad guy. Torture is torture. Torture is wrong and shouldn't be done. People need to be treated with humanity. You cannot use food as a weapon, which means you cannot cut off people's food and water and medical supplies. These are rules of international law, and we really need to abide by them, not just for the sake of the current victims who happen to be today Palestinians and Lebanese, and tomorrow maybe Iranians, but for the sake of everybody. These rules need to be respected.
This issue specifically has caused some rise, quite a bit of rise in the US because the US is probably, it's not probably, it is the most consequential actor involved in the Israeli and Palestinian question. There's been a lot of censorship of the Palestinian cause. Activists, experts, regular people who just care about their families being denied the publicity that media is supposed to provide. What specifically alerted me to how bad and effective the level of censorship was for this specific topic was the Democratic National Convention that took place about a month and a half ago. I mean, there were droves of Palestinian activists that attended and were suspiciously undercut from speaking opportunities or denied entry into the convention and escorted out of the convention for unknown reasons. And these were not, just some of the annoying and unqualified radicals that just want to show up to the convention to cause a ruckus. These were legal experts on issues, delegates for political parties in different states, organizers of the statewide political movements. And after all of the nationwide protests that happened pretty highly publicly, especially at the beginning of this year, including the mass arrests that happened on college campuses for encampments that were taking place in protest for Palestine, it's a gaping hole that it was not much of an issue at the Democratic National Convention, given how big the response was to this rise on this one singular issue. This is the one thing that, the one issue in the United States that has complete, full bipartisan support. What does this level of censorship, what does this level of censorship of the Palestinian cause on the issue reveal to you about the US and Israel? And what has been effective in breaking that censorship barrier?
Well, it is true that there's a very high level of control and censorship over anything that has to do with Palestine and Palestinians. And there are many reasons for it, but this is precisely the reason why I say the Palestinian cause has become the cause of all humanity. Because if you look at it, if you can censor Palestinians, you can censor everybody. And right now, there is a strange situation where censorship of Palestinians is allowed, is tolerated, even by people who are generally progressive. We have a term for them called PEPs, progressive except for Palestine. That people can be involved in liberation struggles, in the rights of everybody, from LGBTQ to racism to the environment to you name it. But when it comes to Palestine, all of a sudden they freeze. All of a sudden it's like that you can't talk about. Why? Why can't you talk about Palestine and Palestinians? What is it that makes us so different from everybody else? And the way you fight it, I think one of the ways that has worked at least is with the social media. Not that social media is itself totally immune from the silencing of Palestinians. We have seen attempts by social media to silence Palestinians as well. But it's harder to do because social media is everywhere and because everybody participates in social media. Yeah, so even though you got Twitter and Facebook, especially trying to censor Palestinian content, there's ways to get around it. And somehow people still get to see and hear the Palestinian message on social media in a way that is stifled by the regular corporate media throughout the world, throughout this country, I mean.
With the upcoming election in the US, I don't have the day count. I meant to pull it up beforehand. I'm not sure exactly how many days there are until the election. But this has become an issue because with the US being one of the most consequential player in the issue of Israel and Palestine, the election feels very seminal given that there's a war going on. There's been a lot of pressure on emphasizing the fact that the Palestinian cause is a global cause worthy of being noted and being protested for by people in America.
The problem is that, and this is a problem again of US politics, not just of the Palestinian question. The problem is the influence of money in politics, that politicians have to raise literally millions and millions and millions of dollars just to run. Last time, 4 years ago, the presidential campaign cost each party upwards of $5 billion. That's money that has to be raised and spent by every presidential candidate. So, as a result, they are very sensitive to those who have money. And that doesn't only apply to Palestinians and the Palestinian questions. It becomes a problem for American democracy. American democracy today has been hijacked. The people who determine American elections today, rather than the people, it's those who have money, those who are willing to put up huge amounts of money that are necessary to run a political campaign in today's America. So as a result, nobody is willing to bring up some really serious issues and discuss them. And one of them, of course, is the Palestinian issue. People are not willing to discuss this on the merits because it costs them. It costs them financially. It costs them politically. They could lose. So they tell you, just elect me, and when I'm in power, then I'll do something. And the reality is when they are in power, and we saw this with President Obama. When he was in power, he didn't do much. He fell under the same pressures that he was under during the campaign and was not able to do anything on the Palestinian issue.
Given that there is a little more investment this time with a war currently happening, there is a little more focus of slightly more attention on the Palestinian cause in this election and pressure to get politicians to speak on the issue, if not actually develop policy as to how to help, how to aid the Palestinian people. But with there's been a movement such as the uncommitted movement that happened during the Democratic primary earlier this year that's actually having some political sway. It is taking votes away. Taking votes away. I don't know if that's possible in a democracy. It's taking votes away from the Democratic candidate and possibly putting the US in a more vulnerable position liberally by contributing to a split in the party that would cause the Republicans to win. And we all know that if the Republicans take the presidency, it would not be good for the Palestinian cause at all. Possibly worse than the Democratic Party, although they're both pretty bad. But the US does have its own issues, own domestic issues invested if, say, the uncommitted vote does not lead to a split in the party, and say the Democrats, who are softer on the issue of Israel, do take the presidency, what other ways can people make demands of their politicians other than with votes, given that there are other issues at stake?
Well, the first thing is Palestinians have not been convinced that the Democrats are really softer. I mean, Biden and Kamala Harris have not been soft at all. They have been supporting the ongoing genocide, defending Israel with the US vetoes, providing weapons, logistic support, and maybe soldiers now to on behalf of Israel in its ongoing genocide. Uh, so it's a good argument to convince the uncommitted to go and vote for the Democrats at this time. And if Trump gets elected, God forbid, it's not going to be the fault of the Palestinians or the progressives. It's going to be the fault of Kamala Harris for refusing to listen to the Palestinian issue and at all. But you ask a very important question, which is when November is over, what should people who are interested in the Palestinian situation or in justice or in Israelis and justice for Israelis, what should they be doing? I think it's false to think that the only thing we can do is once every 4 years vote and hope that the flip of the coin helps us get the lesser of the two evils that is more liberal on our particular issue. Political activism is an ongoing process. Forget about Trump and Harris. What about senators? What about congresspeople? What about city councils? What about boards of education? What about campuses? What about students? In all of these areas, there is room for activism. There is room for people to stand up and do the right thing. There is room for people to challenge the official corporate narrative, which right now is a war narrative, whether it's the Ukraine or whether it's the Middle East or whether it's the cities and the arming of the police and the militarization of the police. There are issues that need to be ongoing, which is why I'm saying the Palestinian issue has become a litmus test for everybody. Do we really believe in the liberal values that we say we believe in? Are we really opposed to racism and apartheid? Do we believe in equality and in ending discrimination? Do we believe in human rights and human dignity? On all of these issues, the Palestinian issue comes up. And these are ongoing issues that don't get resolved in November, that don't get resolved in a presidential election. They require us to be working continuously. Pretty soon we may have an expanded war in Iran. In fact, there is a possibility that that thing may even expand into a nuclear confrontation because Benjamin Netanyahu is not going to be quiet. And if the US doesn't help and support him, he may try and use nuclear weapons against Iran. And try to drag the United States into the conflict, even if the United States doesn't want to get into a conflict with Iran. So this becomes an ongoing issue that we have to be aware of, we have to be active in, and we have to try our best to influence one way or another.
I want to thank you for sitting down with me, speaking to me today. There is a lot going on involving Palestine, and I really appreciate what you have to say.
I just want to end by saying something very important, and that is that this fight, this battle, this issue is not in any way and shouldn't be allowed in any way to be turned into an anti-Jewish or an anti-Semitic thing, because the anti-Semitism is wrong. It's also racism. It's also discrimination. And one of the problems with the Zionist movement and the state of Israel is that it tries to speak on behalf of all Jews and tries to make all Jews responsible for what Israel does and demand. We heard Trump saying, I help your people. I help your president, as if the American Jews don't have an identity of their own and they only have to work in support of Israel all the time, even when it's doing wrong things that they disagree with. So we must be very vigilant not to allow those who are genuinely anti Semitic, who don't like Jews, to take advantage of the current situation and justify their racism, their bigotry, their anti Semitism, their hatred for Jews by using the Palestinian cause. So I want to make that very clear. When we talk about Palestinian rights and when we talk about justice for Palestinians, we're not talking about hating or opposing or discriminating or allowing prejudice against Jews either, because that's just as problematic.
I'm actually really glad you brought that point up. I wasn't exactly sure how to go about addressing it, given that I wanted to focus on the political element here, but I mean, that is a very tangibly significant element of the issue is some people have hijacked the Palestinian cause to promote or to perpetuate anti-Semitism against the Jewish people, and the two are just simply not the same. With I know with an integrated state, the idea of an integrated state would counter this. As you said before, I mean, there were many thousands and thousands of years in which Palestinians and Jewish Arabs that lived alongside one another, and there was never an issue, never once as significant as now. But yes, the actions of the Israeli government is not reflective of Jewish faith, and I really mean to focus a critique on the political side of um of the Israeli leadership. Any final note, where can people find you if they want to contact you or keep up with your work?
Well, they can get on the mailing list of FOSNA, FOSNA.org, FOSNA.org, where I have a weekly blog and we talk about Palestinian liberation theology and we talk about issues of peace and justice on a continuing basis. FOSNA.org. They can also download for free the book Beyond the Two-State Solution from Nonviolence International.net. One word, Nonviolence International.net. And for students, I always tell them there's a quick executive summary in the back of the book. If you don't have time to read the whole book, you can just read the executive summary of what it would look like to have a single state for both Arabs and Jews living together in peace. Thank you. Thank you to all your listeners.